was a cold October night in Pine Ridge, a small, secluded town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying leaves, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows through the skeletal branches of the trees. The town was known for its peace and quiet, but tonight an unnatural stillness had settled over it. Even the usual chorus of nocturnal animals was absent, leaving only the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. Sarah Miller, a journalist from New York City, had come to Pine Ridge to investigate a string of mysterious disappearances. Over the past 6 months, 8 people had vanished without a trace. The police were baffled, and rumors of a curse or a vengeful spirit had begun to spread among the townsfolk. Sarah didn't believe in such things, but she couldn't deny that something strange was happening in this quiet town. She parked her car outside the Pine Ridge Motel, the only lodging in town, and stepped out into the crisp night air. The motel was a rundown, single-story building with flickering neon lights that spelled vacancy. The receptionist, an elderly man with a stooped back and a weary expression, handed her the key to room 7 without a word. Inside, the room was as unremarkable as the motel itself. Faded floral wallpaper, a creaky bed, and a small television that buzzed faintly even when turned off. Sarah set her bag on the bed and opened her laptop to review her notes. Each disappearance had occurred near the outskirts of town, close to the dense forest that surrounded Pine Ridge. Locals spoke of the Hollow, a deep, dark part of the woods where no one dared to venture. It was there that Sarah planned to start her investigation. The next morning, Sarah visited the local diner to gather information. The townsfolk were hesitant to talk, their eyes darting nervously to the windows as if they feared being overheard. Eventually, an old woman named Margaret leaned in close and whispered, "You shouldn't be here, miss. The Hollow, it's not safe. People say they hear voices, see things that aren't there. It's cursed." "Have you seen anything yourself?" Sarah asked. Margaret hesitated, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. "Once. Years ago. I shadows, moving through the trees, but there was no one there, and the feeling like something was watching me. I've never been back." That evening, armed with a flashlight and her camera, Sarah ventured into the Hollow. The forest was unnaturally silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. As she moved deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Her flashlight beam seemed to barely penetrate the darkness, and an oppressive sense of dread settled over her. Suddenly she heard it, a faint whispering, just on the edge of her perception. She froze, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but the words were in a language she couldn't understand. Her heart pounded as she swung the flashlight around, searching for the source. The beam landed on a tree trunk, and she gasped. Carved into the bark were strange symbols, their edges jagged and crude, as if they had been scratched in haste. "What the hell?" Sarah muttered, taking a step closer to examine the symbols. They were unlike anything she'd ever seen, and an inexplicable chill ran down her spine as she traced one with her finger. The whispering stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, a low, guttural growl echoed through the forest. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her flashlight darting wildly. The beam landed on a pair of glowing eyes, just beyond the edge of the light. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal she knew, and they glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The growl deepened, and the eyes began to move closer. Panic surged through her, and she turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. The forest seemed to close in around her, the branches clawing at her clothes and hair as she fled. She could hear heavy footsteps behind her, faster and heavier than her own. Whatever it was gaining on her. She burst into a small clearing and stumbled to a halt. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit cabin, its wooden walls blackened with age. The growling was closer now, almost right behind her. With no other choice, she sprinted for the cabin and threw herself inside, slamming the door shut behind her. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rot and mildew. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of her flashlight. The interior was bare except for a table and a few broken chairs. Strange symbols, similar to the ones she had seen on the tree, were scrawled across the walls in what looked like dried blood. The growling stopped. For a moment, all was silent again. Then, a loud, thunderous banging shook the door. Sarah screamed, backing away until she hit the far wall. The banging grew more intense, the door rattling on its hinges. Whatever was outside wanted in. Desperation took over, and she began searching the cabin for a weapon, anything she could use to defend herself. Her hands closed around a rusted iron poker, and she held it tightly, her knuckles white. The door splintered, and a monstrous clawed hand reached through, groping blindly. Sarah swung the poker with all her strength, striking the hand. The creature let out a deafening roar of pain and withdrew. Taking the opportunity, Sarah bolted for a small window at the back of the cabin. She smashed the glass with the poker and climbed through, cutting her hands on the jagged edges. She hit the ground running, not daring to look back. The forest seemed alive now, the trees twisting and shifting as if trying to trap her. The whispering returned, louder and more frantic, but she pushed it from her mind and focused on escaping. After what felt like hours, she finally broke free of the woods and stumbled onto the road. Her car was just ahead, parked where she had left it. She scrambled inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the edge of the forest, but there was no sign of the creature. Still, she didn't wait to find out if it was following. She sped back to the motel, her hands shaking on the wheel. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept the lights on and the iron poker by her side, her eyes darting to the window at every sound. She knew she couldn't leave Pine Ridge without finding out what was happening, but she also knew she couldn't face the hollow alone again. The next morning, she went to the local library to research the symbols she had seen. The librarian, a stern woman named Evelyn, was initially reluctant to help, but eventually brought out an old, dusty book. Inside were drawings of the symbols, along with references to an ancient cult that had once inhabited the area. The cult, known as the Children of the Shadow, worshipped a malevolent entity they called the Watcher. They believed the Watcher demanded sacrifices to maintain its power, and the disappearances matched the cult's pattern. "Is the cult still active?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's face darkened. "Some say they are, but no one's ever seen them. If they are, you'd best leave this place before you become their next victim." Sarah's resolve hardened. She couldn't leave, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. That night, she returned to the hollow, this time armed with a video camera, a flashlight, and a plan. She followed the path deeper into the woods, her heart pounding with every step. The symbols on the trees became more frequent, and the whispering started again, growing louder as she approached another clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of hooded figures, their faces obscured by shadow. They chanted in the same strange language she had heard before, their voices rising and falling in unison. In the middle of the circle was a stone altar, and on it lay a young woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She raised her camera, capturing the scene as the cultists' chanting grew louder. One of them raised a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. Without thinking, Sarah stepped into the clearing, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Stop!" she shouted. The cultists froze, their heads turning toward her in unison. For a moment, there was only silence. Then one of them stepped forward, pulling back their hood to reveal a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes. "You should not have come here," the figure said, their voice echoing unnaturally. "The Watcher sees you now." Before Sarah could react, the cultists lunged toward her, their movements unnaturally fast. She turned and ran, her camera still recording as she fled. The forest seemed to come alive around her, the trees twisting and writhing as if trying to block her path. The whispering grew deafening, and she felt something cold and clammy brush against her arm. She burst onto the road, her car just ahead. She threw herself inside and started the engine, the tires screeching as she sped away. In the rearview mirror, she saw the cultists standing at the edge of the forest, their hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. Sarah didn't stop until she reached the next town. She handed her footage over to the authorities, but when they returned to Pine Ridge to investigate, they found no sign of the cult or the missing people. The hollow was just an ordinary forest, and the cabin she had described was nowhere to be found. To this day, Sarah's footage remains the only evidence of what happened in Pine Ridge. The disappearances have stopped, but the townsfolk still speak in hushed tones about the Watcher and the cursed forest. And Sarah? She never returned, but she knows that something evil still lurks in the shadows, waiting for its next victim.